There are stories in this world that never rest. Tales that drift through time like ghosts, forever unanswered, forever unresolved. They are not just names on yellowed pages or footnotes in forgotten archives. They are wounds that history never managed to heal. Some vanishings are swallowed by fire, children disappearing in the smoke, leaving behind nothing but silence and speculation. Others dissolve into thin air on lonely roads and wilderness paths, as if the earth itself opened wide to claim them. And there are those who set out on grand adventures, only to be consumed by the very landscapes they sought to conquer. In every case, the same question remains. Where did they go, and why has the truth refused to surface? The voices of the lost echo faintly carried on the wind, locked in old photographs, sealed inside letters never answered. The past does not let go so easily. It lingers, waiting, reminding us that certainty is fragile, and the line between fact and legend is thinner than we wish to believe. Tonight, we will not find closure. We will not uncover neat explanations or tidy endings. Instead, we step into the shadows where history grows cold and memory falters, into stories where each answer only births a dozen more questions. These are mysteries that have outlived their time, that cling to the darkness, daring us to look closer. But before we descend into these twisted labyrinths of the unknown, pause for a moment. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? If it's night, then you're sharing this journey with the stillness of the dark. The world has quieted, and time itself seems to hold its breath. Night has a way of making mysteries feel closer, as though the silence itself is listening alongside you. If it's day, then perhaps the sun is shining where you are, and yet, even in the light, shadows of the past remain. Disappearances, unanswered questions, lives that slipped away without explanation. These mysteries belong to no hour. They linger whether the sky is bright or dim. So, wherever you are, and whatever the clock reads, let us step together into stories that have never truly let go of their secrets. On Christmas Eve, 1945, in the quiet town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, a fire consumed the Sodder family home. Authorities called it an accident, a tragic blaze sparked by faulty wiring, but the story didn't end in ashes. 5 children were said to have perished that night, yet no remains were ever found in the rubble, not a trace. To the grieving family, the fire was no accident. They believed it was arson, a distraction meant to cover something far darker, the kidnapping of their children. What was buried in that smoke and silence? Was it a simple tragedy or a carefully staged disappearance? For nearly 4 decades, a haunting sight greeted travellers on Route 16 near Fayetteville, West Virginia. A weathered billboard stood against the landscape, carrying grainy black and white faces of 5 solemn-eyed children: Maurice, age 14, Martha, age 12, Louis, age 9, Jenny, just 8, and Betty, only 5. Beneath their photographs, a chilling question was stenciled in bold letters. What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or are they still alive? It was not just a sign. It was a wound carved into the town's memory, and a mystery that refused to fade. Fayetteville was, and still is, a small town, a place where whispers travel faster than truth, and rumours hold more weight than evidence. And in the Sodder case, no one could even agree on one simple question: were the children dead, or were they alive? On Christmas Eve, 1945, George and Jenny Sodder gathered with 9 of their 10 children inside their home. Laughter filled the rooms. The tree glowed with light. It was a night meant for joy. But by 1 a.m., the house was burning. Flames devoured the Sodder home. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children escaped into the freezing night. The other 5 were never seen again. The Sodder home was alive with fire. In the chaos, who lived and who vanished came down to nothing more than where they had chosen to sleep that Christmas Eve. 2-year-old Sylvia survived only because her crib was kept in her parents' room, and Jenny and George carried her outside through the smoke. Marion, the oldest daughter, had been awake. She escaped quickly. George Jr. and John, the older sons, shared an upstairs room together. They stumbled down through the smoke, their hair singed by flames, but alive. But the others, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and little Betty, had no such luck. They were separated into 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, both cut off by the staircase now turned into a wall of fire. George tried everything. A window shattered, his arm ripped open by glass as he forced his way back in. The smoke blinded him, the heat drove him back. From outside, he screamed their names into the night. But no answer ever came. 5 children saved by placement. 5 children vanished into the fire. The children's father, George Sodder, raced back into the cold night. His mind a storm of desperate calculations. If the staircase was gone, then the upstairs windows were the only chance. He always kept a ladder leaning against the side of the house. Always. But on this night, it was nowhere to be found. Vanished. Frantic, another idea struck. His coal trucks. They were parked just steps away, and he could drive one up against the wall, climb onto its roof, and reach his children. But when he turned the key, the engine gave nothing. Dead. He ran to the 2nd truck. Same result. Neither would start, though they had roared to life only the day before. Time was bleeding away. George turned to the rain barrel for water, only to find it frozen solid by the December cold. He had nothing left. No ladder, no trucks, no water, no way inside. 5 of his children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still trapped within, their small bodies hidden somewhere behind the great whipping ropes of smoke. George didn't even notice the blood slicking down his arm from the broken glass. He didn't hear his own voice breaking from the screams of their names. All he knew was that the fire devoured everything and gave nothing back. As the house burned, Marion, the eldest Sodder daughter, ran barefoot through the dark winter night to a neighbour's home, desperate to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. But on the other end, silence. No operator ever picked up. Another neighbour, seeing the blaze rising into the sky, tried from a nearby tavern. Again, no response, no alarm, no urgency. Finally exasperated, a neighbour climbed into his car and sped into town, where he tracked down Fire Chief F.J. Morris. But Fayetteville had no sirens, no radios, no central alarm. Instead, the chief initiated what passed as a fire alert, a phone tree. One man called another, who called another, and so on. The fire station was only 2.5 miles away. Yet by the time the volunteers arrived, nearly 8 hours later, the Sodder home was nothing more than a smoking pile of ash. Back then, a Fayetteville firefighter later admitted that there was very little training. Everyone was a volunteer, and they didn't have much equipment. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, George and Jenny Sodder could only assume the unthinkable, that 5 of their children had perished in the fire. Neighbours joined in a brief search of the smouldering ruins, sifting through ash and rubble, but what they found was chilling in its absence. No bodies, no bones, not even fragments. Fire Chief F.J. Morris offered an explanation. The blaze, he claimed, had burned so hot it had reduced the children's bodies to nothing. Complete cremation, but experts would later insist that was nearly impossible. House fires don't reach the kind of heat needed to leave no trace. Bones survive, always. And yet here, there was nothing. Only smoke and silence. The official word came quickly. A state police inspector blamed the fire on faulty wiring. To George, the site was sacred ground. He shoveled 5 feet of dirt across the basement ruins, intending it to be a memorial to the 5 children who were gone. Within days, the coroner's office closed the case. 5 death certificates were issued before the new year. The cause of death, fire, or suffocation. But to the Sodders, the paperwork meant nothing, because what haunted them most was not the fire itself, but the silence of the ruins. Where were the remains? Why was there nothing left to bury? Marian would later confess that, even in the chaos, her eyes were fixed on those upstairs windows. She waited for a glimpse, a shadow, a cry, any sign of her brothers and sisters. But the glass stayed dark, silent, empty. And then there was something else. Something that haunted her even more. The smell. Fire consumes everything, and the burning of flesh, they say, can be detected for miles. But Marian never smelled it. Not once. To her, that silence, that absence, spoke louder than the roar of the flames. It was as though the children had not been there at all. This single detail would fester in the family's memory, planting a seed of doubt, a question that grew heavier with each passing year. Were the Sodder children truly lost in the fire, or had they been taken, while the blaze served as a cover for something far more sinister? But as the ash cooled and the days passed, the Sodder family began to wonder, what if the children had not died in the fire at all? Why were there no bones in the ruins? The official reports said their children had been lost to the flames. But in their hearts, the Sodders felt something else, that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and little Betty might still be alive. But before we go deeper into the mystery, it's important to understand a little about Sodder. George Sodder, born in Tula, Sardinia in 1895, George left his homeland at the age of 13. He arrived at Ellis Island with his older brother, but within hours he was alone. His brother returned to Italy, leaving young George to forge his life in a strange new world. He started at the bottom, working the railroads of Pennsylvania, hauling water and supplies for labourers. But George was sharp, ambitious, restless. In time, he moved south to West Virginia, where opportunity seemed to lie in coal and construction. There, he built a modest trucking business with his own two hands, and it was in Fayetteville, in a little store called the Music Box, that George's story took its most fateful turn. Behind the counter stood Jenny Cipriani, the shopkeeper's daughter. Like George, she too was an immigrant, brought from Italy as a child. Their meeting would change everything. George and Jenny married, and, over the span of 2 decades, brought 10 children into the world between 1923 and 1943. They planted their roots in Fayetteville, a quiet Appalachian town with a small but close-knit Italian immigrant community. To outsiders, the Sodders looked like a picture of stability. One county magistrate would later call them one of the most respected middle-class families around. George himself was a man of presence, outspoken on business, politics, and world affairs. Yet for all his boldness, there was one subject he never spoke of: his past. He had been born in Sardinia and left Italy as a boy. But why? What had compelled him to abandon his homeland? George never revealed the truth, not to his friends, not to his children, not even to Jenny. He never explained what had happened back in Italy to make him want to leave. In the days after the fire, the Sodders planted flowers over the ashes, where their home once stood. But as the smoke cleared, so did the memories. Uneasy fragments they began stitching together into a troubling picture. Months before the blaze, a stranger had appeared at their door, asking about hauling work. He wandered to the back of the house, paused by the fuse boxes, and made a remark George would never forget. "This is going to cause a fire someday." The comment struck him as peculiar. George had recently had the wiring inspected by the local power company. Their report? Everything was perfectly safe. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than idle talk, but now it carried a far darker weight. Not long after, another encounter disturbed the Sodders. A man had come to their home, offering life insurance. When George declined, the man's demeanour shifted, his sales pitch turning into a threat. He threatened that the house will be going up in the smoke, and the children were going to be destroyed, and that he'll be paying for the dirty remarks he'd been making about Mussolini. George was no stranger to heated arguments. He was outspoken about his hatred for Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, a view that often put him at odds with members of Fayetteville's Italian community. Still, he dismissed the threat as bluster. Only later would those words echo back to him, like a warning he should have never ignored. It wasn't just George who remembered strange encounters. Other members of the family noticed something unsettling in the weeks before Christmas. A car, parked near their home. Inside, a man sat watching, silent, motionless. He wasn't watching the road. He wasn't watching the house. He was watching the Sodder children as they returned from school. At the time, it seemed peculiar, innocent perhaps. But after the fire, that image of the stranger lingered, a shadow on the edges of memory that felt less like coincidence. Just after midnight, in the early hours of Christmas morning, the quiet of the Sodder home was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. Jenny hurried to answer. On the line, a woman's voice. Unfamiliar, asking for a name Jenny didn't recognize. Behind her, the sound of laughter, glasses clinking, the din of some distant party. Jenny calmly told the caller she had the wrong number and hung up. Police would later track down the woman. She insisted it had been nothing more than a mistake, a misdial. On her way back to bed, Jenny caught sight of small details that pricked at her sense of order. The downstairs lights still glared, the curtains left wide, the front door ajar. Marion was asleep on the sofa, but the rest of the house seemed too still, too quiet for Christmas Eve. She moved through the rooms, switching off the lamps, pulling the curtains closed, sliding the lock into place. Then she returned to her room, finally allowing herself to drift towards sleep. Moments later, a sudden metallic crash shattered the calm. A bang against the roof, followed by a strange rolling thud, like something heavy tumbling out of sight. Jenny lay awake, unsettled, straining to hear more. But the night fell silent again. It was only half an hour later, when she stirred once more, that the true horror revealed itself. The air was thick and acrid. Smoke was snaking into her room. The house was burning. Jenny could not accept what officials told her, that 5 children had been reduced to nothing in less than an hour. The idea gnawed at her day after day. How could a fire leave behind appliances, still recognizable, yet erase human bodies without a trace? She decided to test it herself. In her yard, she gathered animal bones, chicken, beef joints, pork chops, and set them alight. Each time, the flames died down, and each time she was left with the same thing, a heap of charred, stubborn bones. Her doubts only deepened when she spoke to a crematorium worker. He told her that even at 2,000 degrees, and even after 2 hours, bones remain. The Sodder house had burned for just 45 minutes, and yet 5 children were gone. Not a single fragment was ever found. The unsettling details only multiplied. A telephone repairman examined the damage and revealed something chilling. The Sodders' phone lines had not burned in the fire. They had been cut. The official report had claimed faulty wiring as the cause, but that explanation now seemed impossible. If the wiring had failed, the house should have gone dark. Yet Jenny remembered clearly. The lights downstairs had glowed brightly, even as flames consumed the home. The evidence suggested something more deliberate, something planned, and with each discovery, the Sodders' doubts about the official story only grew stronger. The puzzle deepened when a witness stepped forward. He claimed he had seen a man at the fire that night, stealing a block and tackle, the very kind used to pull car engines. Could this theft explain why George's coal trucks had suddenly refused to start? The man later admitted to taking the equipment, but swore he had nothing to do with the blaze. Still, the timing was uncanny. Then a discovery by little Sylvia raised new questions. While wandering the ruins of their home, the youngest Sodder child stumbled upon a strange hard rubber object lying in the grass. Jenny's memory came flooding back, the sharp thud on the roof, followed by that rolling sound just before the flames. George studied the object and grew grim. He was convinced it wasn't some random scrap. It looked like a napalm pineapple bomb. the kind used in warfare. Then came the whispers, sightings that seemed too precise, too vivid to ignore. The first came from a woman who claimed that on the very night of the fire, as the Sodder home burned in the distance, she saw children, 5 of them, pressed against the windows of a passing car. Their small faces, pale in the glow of flames, seemed to be staring back. Not long after, another report surfaced. A woman who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, about 50 miles northwest, told police she had seen the missing children the very next morning. She claimed to have them serve breakfast. She remembered, too, that a car with Florida license plates had been parked outside. The strangest account came from a Charleston hotel. A woman, after seeing the children's faces in a newspaper, was certain she had encountered 4 of them just a week after the fire. In her statement to police, she described the scene in chilling detail. They weren't alone. They were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all Italian. The group arrived near midnight and registered for a large room with several beds. She tried speaking to the children to put them at ease, but the men shut her out. One of them fixed her with a hard, hostile stare before turning to the others, muttering rapidly in Italian. At once, the group went silent. It was as she no longer existed. The next morning, they were gone. These testimonies added yet another layer to the Sodder mystery. If true, they suggested something far more sinister than a tragic fire. Something planned, deliberate, and still unresolved. By 1947, the unanswered questions had gnawed at George and Jenny for nearly 2 years. Desperate, they took their search to the highest authority they could think of, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They drafted a letter pleading for help in uncovering the truth of what had happened to their 5 missing children. To their surprise, a reply came, not from an agent, but from the Bureau's formidable director himself, J. Edgar Hoover. His words were firm, almost clinical, when he told them that although he would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau. There was, however, a glimmer of hope. Hoover explained that his agents could assist if the local authorities requested it. But when approached, the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined. And just like that, the possibility of a federal investigation vanished. The Sodders were left once more with their questions, their grief, and the uneasy suspicion that someone didn't want the truth uncovered. Desperate for answers, George and Jenny turned to a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley. What he uncovered only deepened the unease. Insurance salesman who had once stood in their parlour warning that fire would destroy their home was no stranger to the case. He had sat on the coroner's jury that officially labelled the fire accidental. Even stranger, records showed he had once been employed by George, and without the Sodders' knowledge, had quietly increased the family's insurance policy just months before the blaze. Then came another disturbing revelation. Rumour had it that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had not been entirely truthful. Though he told the family no remains had been found, Tinsley heard whispers that Morris had privately admitted to discovering something in the ashes, a human organ. Supposedly, he had hidden it away in a dynamite box and buried it on the property. The pieces did not fit. Instead, they suggested something darker, as though the truth of that night had been deliberately concealed. Unable to ignore the rumour, the Sodders dug up the box themselves. Inside lay the so-called organ. They carried it to a local funeral director who examined it carefully before delivering his verdict. It wasn't human at all. It was a piece of beef liver, completely untouched by fire. Word spread quickly. Soon the Sodders heard whispers that Chief Morris had planted it there himself. The story went that he hadn't discovered it in the ashes at all, but quietly buried it afterward, hoping that the family, finding remains, might finally lay their grief to rest and abandon their search for answers. The fire marshal was either paid off, or they just didn't care to push it. John Sodder, the eldest son, told the Roanoke Times in 1984. Even decades later, the family remained unsettled. They couldn't say for certain what had happened that Christmas night, but they knew something was wrong. The official explanation never sat right. Perhaps, they thought, the blaze was not a tragedy of faulty wiring at all, but a cover-up. Had the fire been deliberately set to conceal something far darker? Some believed the missing 5 had been taken by the Italian mafia, payback for George's outspoken contempt for Mussolini. Others whispered of human trafficking, children spirited away in the chaos of the flames. John himself admitted the thought that haunted him most was that they might have been trying to take us all. My brother and I barely got out of the house, but you can't relive it. The possibilities were chilling. And yet, without answers, the questions only grew heavier with time. In the years that followed, the trail never truly went cold. Whispers, sightings, and anonymous tips continued to trickle in, each one keeping the Sodders' hopes alive. One day, George's eyes caught on a newspaper photograph of schoolchildren in New York City. Among the crowd of unfamiliar faces, he swore he recognized one, his daughter Betty. The resemblance was so striking that it shook him. Driven by equal parts hope and desperation, he climbed into his truck and set out for Manhattan. When he finally reached the family of the girl in the photograph, his pleas were met with a closed door. The parents refused to speak with him, leaving George with nothing but unanswered questions, an gnawing sense that he had been close, perhaps unbearably close, to the truth. In August of 1949, nearly 4 years after the fire, the Sodders returned to the site that had once been their home. This time, they were determined to leave no stone unturned. They brought in Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, a respected pathologist from Washington, D.C., to oversee a fresh excavation. The dig was painstaking. Out of the blackened soil emerged odd fragments of a life once lived. Charred coins, a half-burned dictionary, and then something more unsettling. Shards of vertebrae. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. Their report was clinical, precise, and yet deeply troubling. That stated the following. The human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy, the oldest missing Sodder child. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a boy 14.5 years old to show age 16 or 17 maturation. The Smithsonian's conclusion left the family suspended in a chilling uncertainty. The bones did not match the age of their children, so if not theirs, whose were they? Decades later, new voices tried to explain the unexplainable. In 2016, retired firefighter Cruikshank told the Times West Virginian that perhaps the fire's fury was not as mysterious as the Sodders believed. He noted that George had kept work materials in the family's garage, 55-gallon drums of gasoline, motors, the kinds of things that could have stoked the blaze to an inferno. And then there was George's own desperate act in the aftermath. In shoveling dirt over the smouldering ruins, he may have unwittingly sealed in the heat. In doing so, the paper reported, he inadvertently created an oven that would advance the cremation process. In 2005, author Stacey Horn, who had examined the Sodder case for NPR, added her own reflection on the fire. She argued that one of the most oft-repeated details, that the Sodder home had burned for only 45 minutes, was misleading. The truth, Horn wrote, was far darker. The blaze burned all night long and into the next morning. When the fire department finally arrived, the ruins were still smouldering. Firefighters had to drench the site with water before even attempting a search. And that search, Horn noted, was hardly exhaustive. 2 hours, she wrote, was nowhere near enough. In modern investigations, combing through such a scene would take days, possibly weeks. To Horn, the question was not whether the fire had burned long enough. It was whether anyone had truly looked deep enough. The Smithsonian's report did not bring closure. It only deepened the divide between official conclusions and the Sodders' unrelenting doubts. 2 hearings followed at the state capitol in Charleston. When they ended, Governor Okie L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W. E. Burchett offered a final chilling verdict. The search was hopeless. With that, the case was formally closed. Authorities quietly suggested what many outsiders already whispered, that grief had clouded the Sodders' judgment. driving them to chase shadows, to search for life where none existed. But George and Jenny refused to let go. If the state would not look, they would. Along Route 16, a towering billboard soon went up, bearing the faces of their missing children. Flyers were pressed into hands across the country. The family offered a $5,000 reward for answers, later doubling it to $10,000. The message was clear. The search was far from over. Letters and whispers kept the Sodders' hopes alive. One came from St. Louis. A woman insisted that Martha, the eldest girl, was hidden away in a convent. Another tip surfaced in Texas. A bar patron swore they'd overheard men speaking of a terrible fire, a Christmas Eve blaze in West Virginia, with words that sounded too close to the Sodders' tragedy to be coincidence. Then came a claim from Florida that the missing children were living with a distant relative of Jenny's. Each time, George packed his bags and went chasing the trail. St. Louis, Texas, Florida, he followed them all. But every lead unraveled into nothing, and always he returned to Fayetteville empty-handed, the mystery intact. In the late 1960s, more than 2 decades after the fire, Jenny opened her mailbox to find an envelope postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a single photograph. The image showed a man in his mid-20s, staring back at the camera with dark, familiar eyes. On the reverse side, in uneven handwriting, was a message as strange as it was chilling, stating that, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie." Jenny and George studied the face in silence. The resemblance was undeniable. The man bore the same thick, dark curls, the same deep brown eyes. His nose was straight, strong, unmistakably George's. Even the slight upward lift of his left eyebrow echoed Louis, who had been only 9 years old on that fateful night. Desperate, the Sodders once again turned to a private investigator, dispatching him to Kentucky. But this time, he vanished without a trace. They never heard from him again, fearful that revealing the town's name, or even the note itself, might place their son in danger. George and Jenny chose secrecy. Quietly, they updated their now famous billboard, replacing the childhood image of Louis with the new photograph of the man he might have become. By 1968, George's voice carried both defiance and exhaustion when he spoke to the Associated Press. It's hard sometimes to get to sleep at night, just wondering about them. After all, if someone wanted to get me, why did they get my family too? It's like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further. We just don't know what to do now. George Sodder died in 1968, still chasing shadows and hoping for a break that never came. He never learned the fate of his children, never discovered whether they had survived or perished that night, leaving a lifetime of grief suspended in unanswered questions. Jenny, heartbroken but resolute, erected fences around her property and added room upon room to her home. Each new layer a quiet fortress against the outside world, each wall a testament to loss and vigilance. She wore black every day until her death in 1989, mourning not just the children she had lost, but the life that might have been. The billboard that had long stood along Route 16 finally came down, yet her children and grandchildren continued the search, devising theories and following every hint. Perhaps the local mafia had tried to recruit George and he refused. Perhaps someone they knew had whisked the children to safety during the fire. If they had survived, maybe they remained in hiding, protecting their parents from afar. In 2012, Smithsonian Magazine published The Children Who Went Up in Smoke, recounting the enduring mystery. At that time, Sylvia, the youngest and last surviving Sodder child, was still alive. Over the years, the author had kept in touch with Jenny Henthorne, granddaughter of George and Jenny Sodder. She generously responded to readers' questions, the most frequent being whether the family had pursued consumer genetic testing to search for their missing relatives. Jenny explained that her mother's DNA was on file with the West Virginia State Police database, but the family chose not to engage in commercial testing, respecting the privacy of potential descendants. I have maintained all through this process that we only want to find those who want to be found, she said, her words carrying the quiet weight of a family's enduring hope and sorrow. Sylvia died in 2021 at the age of 79, never believing her siblings perished in the fire. Her earliest memories were of that night in 1945, when she was 2 years old, the sight of her father bleeding, the screams and the roaring flames. Even in her final years, she spent time visiting crime-sleuthing websites and engaging with those still fascinated by the mystery, never relinquishing hope that one day the truth might emerge. Jenny Henthorne's reflections echoed this same determination. Though decades had passed, she felt the children's absence every day, a persistent ache that no passage of time could dull. Even now, the fate of the children who disappeared that night remains a haunting enigma, a story without an ending. The Sodder family lived in the shadow of a fire that took more than a house. It took certainty, peace, and answers. Yet through decades of grief, tireless searching, and whispers of hope, they embodied a lesson that lingers. Even in the face of tragedy and the unknown, love and perseverance endure, carrying the memory of those lost forward while the world waits for a truth that may never come. Los Angeles, 1928. A city caught between two lives, half farmland, half Hollywood. A restless sprawl, where orange groves withered beside neon lights, and the promise of dreams was always shadowed by whispers of corruption and crime. Beneath its glittering surface, darkness waited. And in March of that year, a story emerged that seemed to embody the city itself, dazzling, grotesque, and unresolved. On the bright afternoon of March 10th, 1928, in a modest Mount Washington home, a small and ordinary act set fate into motion. A dime changed hands. Christine Collins, a quiet, hard-working telephone operator, pressed the coin into the palm of her 9-year-old son. Walter, tall for his age, earnest-eyed and bespectacled, wanted only the simple joy of a Saturday matinee in the neighborhood movie house. The world outside looked safe, the spring sun golden across the streets. With the innocence of a child and a mother's trust, he slipped out the front door. It was supposed to be routine. It was supposed to be safe. But night fell, and Walter did not return. By dusk, Christine stood at her window, scanning the road. By 10, she had walked to the theatre herself, searching for his face in the dispersing crowds. By midnight, her hands shook as she called police, words catching in her throat. Her son, the centre of her small and steady world, was gone. The silence of that night would never lift. Neighbours whispered that perhaps he had run away. The police suggested she wait. Children wander, they said. But Christine knew Walter was no runaway. Something had reached into the ordinary fabric of her life and torn it in half. The boy had vanished into the city, into its labyrinth of shadows and secrets, and what began as a mother's desperate search would soon unravel into one of Los Angeles' strangest, most macabre mysteries. A story of impostors, coercion, madness, and murder, and always, at its aching heart, the unanswered question, what really happened to Walter Collins? The city responded like a body jolted with fear. Police patrols spread into the streets, lanterns sweeping alleyways and vacant lots, their beams glancing off rusted tin and broken bottles. At dawn, mounted officers combed through orange groves on the city's edge, while elsewhere, divers dredged the murky waters of Lincoln Park Lake, raking at silt in search of a small body that never surfaced. Still, the boy was nowhere. He seemed to have slipped through the seams of Los Angeles itself, dissolving into rumour and suggestion. Whispers multiplied. One family swore they had seen him in Oakland. Others said they passed him along the crowded streets of San Francisco. One particularly chilling account came from a gas station attendant in Glendale. He described seeing a child, limp and mute, wrapped in sheets of newspaper in the back seat of a sedan. Only the boy's face protruded, pale and staring. He looked like that Collins kid, the man recalled, identifying him later from a photograph in the paper. Behind the wheel, the attendant claimed, sat a foreign-looking man, probably Italian, a woman beside him. But this trail, too, twisted into nothingness. The city teetered on edge, and small wonder. Barely 3 months earlier, Los Angeles had been gutted by the Marion Parker murder, a crime so barbaric that the city would carry its scars for years. 12-year-old Marion, kidnapped by William the Fox Hickman, had been grotesquely dismembered, her body thrown from the back of a car in pieces. That case had only just concluded in Hickman's capture and execution. Now, another child was missing, another innocent and stolen from under the California sun. Panic seeped into the public consciousness like smoke, drifting into schoolyards, church pews, corner shops. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter. Newspapers screamed for justice. Rumours swirled like vultures. Were murderers roaming free? Were predators stalking their children? And above them all loomed the LAPD, stumbling under the weight of public expectation. The department was already tarnished by corruption scandals, accused of gambling rings, bootlegging protection, and incompetence. Public trust teetered on collapse. Finding Walter Collins was not simply a duty. It was a test of whether Los Angeles had any faith left to give its police. The command was clear: bring the boy home. But as the hunt deepened, what unfolded was no triumph. What began as a child's disappearance descended not into resolution, but into scandal, deception, and one of the most haunting mysteries in Los Angeles history. It would become a story of imposters in borrowed faces, a mother branded insane for telling the truth, a city's police force steeped in arrogance, and a killer hiding beyond the orange groves on a ranch of horrors. And at the centre of it all, a boy who seemed to vanish not into death, but into silence. A silence Los Angeles would never break. 5 months after Walter's disappearance, hope arrived by wire. A telegram from Illinois. A boy had surfaced in the town of DeKalb, thin but alive, claiming, "My name is Walter Collins." It struck Christine like lightning in the dark. For 5 endless months, her days had been a carousel of police indifference, false sightings, and bitter silence. Now, at last, a whisper offered reunion. Photographs came first. The face in them tugged at something inside her, yet uncertainty gnawed, a mother's intuition whispering that something was wrong. Still, what choice was there? Doubt and hope tangled themselves into a fragile bargain. She scraped together $70, a heavy sum for a working woman in the Depression years, and had the boy sent west. When his train slid into Union Station, the crowd hushed, expecting a miracle reunion. But Christine's heart plummeted. The boy stepped off the train smiling, reporters leaning close to capture the joyful picture. Yet behind the cameras, Christine froze. This was not Walter. The voice was pitched differently. The teeth did not align with her son's dental history. The boy's eyes, it was as if a stranger looked back through her child's glasses. Her words were quiet but firm. "This is not my son." But Los Angeles could not afford another embarrassment. Captain J.J. Jones, bloated with arrogance and cornered by the city's expectant citizens, brushed her protests aside. "You're mistaken," he insisted. "Take him home. Try him out," as if Walter Collins, a missing flesh-and-blood child, could be exchanged like borrowed clothing. Christine, exhausted by grief and manipulated by authority, relented. The strange boy slept in Walter's bed, ate at her table, even called her mother. For 3 suffocating weeks, Christine forced herself to believe, scrutinizing his every gesture, searching through the haze of denial. But truth hovered like a spectre. This was not Walter. Resolve returned. Christine gathered the evidence. Walter's dental records, which proved her boy had fillings this impostor lacked. Neighbours and friends swore in affidavits. This was a fraud, not Walter Collins. With her proofs in hand, she marched to the police station, certain the ordeal was ending. Instead, she encountered the most harrowing betrayal yet. Captain Jones listened in silence, then let his fury boil over. "What are you trying to do? Make fools out of us," he spat. His voice cut through the station like a lash. "Are you shirking your duty as a mother? You are the most cruel-hearted woman I've ever known. You're a fool." And then, the unthinkable. Christine Collins was seized by officers and sent away. Her diagnosis was not born of medicine, but convenience. With a stroke of a pen, she was branded under Code 12 internment, a sinister mechanism that allowed police to lock away anyone deemed troublesome or inconvenient. Christine's crime was not madness, it was the refusal to bow before a lie. Within the walls of the Los Angeles County Hospital's psychiatric ward, the mother's world unraveled. Sedatives blurred her thoughts, her protest muffled under the white-hot shame of officials who decreed her unstable. She was grieving, desperate, but sane. Yet the uniformed men who held her captive insisted on rewriting her reality. All the while, the imposter lived free, cloaked in Walter's stolen name. While Christine endured the fog of needles and the humiliation of forced confinement, police interrogated the boy. The performance, already fraying, snapped under pressure. He confessed he was not Walter Collins. He was Arthur Hutchins, a runaway from Iowa, just 12 years old. His mother had died. His stepmother despised him. He had fled across America, searching for escape. One day, in a roadside diner, someone remarked how much he resembled the missing Los Angeles boy, whose story filled newspapers nationwide. Arthur's imagination seized the suggestion. This was opportunity. A way west. A way to Hollywood. He longed to meet his screen idol, cowboy star Tom Mix, and would weave any lie to ride the myth toward California. Arthur hitched himself to Walter's story, wore his missing life like a borrowed mask, and walked boldly into the fantasy. And the police, desperate for salvation in the public's eyes, clasped at the illusion with both hands. At last, Christine was released from her wrongful captivity, the cruel fraud exposed, vindicated, but not restored. She had lost more than time. The police had stolen her dignity. They had ground her suffering into farce, locking her away like a criminal not for lying, but for daring to tell the truth. Worst of all, they had wasted the weeks she might have spent searching for her real son. The imposter melted back into obscurity, but his charade left scars. America marvelled at the sheer audacity of the boy, but beneath the novelty lay tragedy. Walter Collins remained missing. Christine's ordeal had been a cruel distraction, a grotesque joke played at her expense, and at the expense of a child whose absence had yet to be explained. What had begun as an abduction case twisted into something more sinister, a reflection of a city police force willing to trade truth for appearances, and of a mother punished for refusing to stop loving her child. And as Christine stepped out of the hospital, the mystery deepened again, darker than before, for behind the boy's vanished shadow, still unanswered, a grimmer secret waited in the deserts east of Los Angeles. The nightmare of the Wineville Chicken Coop Ranch was about to erupt. Even as the imposter scandal unraveled, police unearthed a more chilling revelation in Wineville, a dusty farm town east of Los Angeles. On a bleak ranch behind rows of coops, investigators found cleavers crusted with blood, shreds of bone smothered with quicklime, and traces of horror almost too vast to comprehend. The ranch belonged to Gordon Stewart Northcott, a soft-featured young man with a sadistic appetite for boys. He kidnapped them, kept them in the ramshackle coops, and when his pleasures waned, butchered them. His victims were lured with promises of work or play. His accomplice was his own mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, with whom he shared a disturbing incestuous bond. Between 1926 and 1928, young boys began vanishing from the Los Angeles and Riverside County areas. Some simply disappeared after playing in the streets. Others were last seen walking home from school. Among them were the Winslow brothers, Nelson, 10, and Lewis, 12, in May 1928, and potentially Walter Collins. At first, the disappearances were not connected. The LAPD was plagued by corruption and disorganization, and proper record-keeping and coordination between jurisdictions was lacking. The turning point came in September 1928 when Jessie Clark, a 19-year-old Canadian, wrote to US authorities claiming that her younger brother, Sanford Clark, then 15, was being held against his will on a chicken ranch in Wineville, Riverside County, about 50 miles from LA. Canadian immigration authorities acted on the tip and visited the ranch. They discovered Sanford, malnourished and terrified. He was immediately taken into protective custody. Under questioning, Sanford revealed that his older cousin, Gordon Stewart Northcott, had lured him from Canada and forced him into servitude at the ranch. He was beaten, sexually abused, and made to assist in horrific crimes. Sanford described how Northcott had kidnapped young boys, imprisoned them in chicken coops, sexually assaulted them, and eventually killed them with an axe or by other violent means. According to Sanford, Northcott sometimes forced him to participate under threats of death or to dispose of bodies by burning flesh and dissolving bones in quicklime. Acting on Sanford's statements, investigators descended on the ranch. What they uncovered was a grotesque crime scene, scattered bone fragments, some lodged in chicken dung and coops, blood-stained axes and hammers, hair and body parts believed to belong to children. Neighbours reported hearing screams late at night, but dismissed them as animal noises. Realizing the police were closing in, Gordon fled with his mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, to Canada. They were arrested near Vernon, British Columbia, after months on the run, and extradited to California. Under pressure, Sarah confessed to killing Walter Collins with an axe and claimed she buried him near the chicken coops. But she recanted repeatedly, changing her story, and her testimony became inconsistent. Nevertheless, she was sentenced to life in prison without trial after pleading guilty in 1929. Walter was listed among likely victims by both Gordon and Sarah Northcott, but no body or identifiable remains were ever found. Sarah's statements about Walter shifted constantly. Gordon alternately taunted Christine by claiming he killed Walter, then retracted the claim. Because of these contradictions, Walter's disappearance remains one of the case's enduring mysteries. Christine Collins never bowed to the story others sought to write for her. Officials declared her son dead. Detectives pointed to fragments of bone in the dust at Wineville. Even Sarah Louise Northcott, with whispered confessions wrung from her lips, claimed that Walter had been among the slaughtered. But Christine could not surrender her faith. The evidence was shadow-thin, the testimonies contradictory, and always the unbearable truth. No body had ever been found. For Christine, grief froze into something more enduring than sorrow. Resolve. Against the LAPD's arrogance, against Northcott's cruel games, against the gnawing silence of unending uncertainty, she clung to the flicker of her maternal instinct, so dim, yet unextinguished. Somewhere, she believed, Walter lived. Then, on the eve of Gordon Stewart Northcott's execution at San Quentin Prison, October 1930, the silence broke. Christine received a telegram, its words heavy with the weight of damnation and salvation. Gordon claimed he had lied. He promised her the truth. If she came to him before his death, he would at last unveil Walter's fate. Christine, her heart raw with years of waiting, seized upon it. She travelled north, every mile tightening like a garrote around her chest. At last, closure. At last, the truth of what had become of her boy. In the stone belly of San Quentin, she faced him, the thin, boyish murderer, his hands fragile as porcelain, his eyes glinting with secrets, looked upon the desperate mother who had never ceased to plead for her son. But instead of confession, he recoiled. "I don't want to see you," he whispered, cowardice stealing his tongue. "I don't know anything about it. I'm innocent." And just like that, he betrayed her again. Soon after, Gordon Stewart Northcott mounted the gallows. Witnesses said his face was carved with panic, his breath shallow, his lips moving soundlessly even as the hood dropped. The rope snapped and with him fell the truth forever buried. For anyone else, this might have been the end. But fate had one more wicked turn. Months after Northcott's execution, an astonishing revelation surfaced. One of the boys long believed to have been his victim was found alive. A child thought murdered in the coops of Wineville had not perished after all. The revelation struck Christine like divine lightning. If one boy could have survived Northcott's cruelty, hidden from the bloody tally of victims, why not Walter? That single exception became her creed. If there was a crack in the nightmare through which life had slipped, then Walter might have found his way through too. Christine clutched to that impossible glimmer, transforming it into the compass of her life. Decades passed. The city changed. Orange groves giving way to freeways, neon replaced by steel and glass. But Christine Collins remained unchanged. She pursued rumours like fading echoes. A boy working in a diner in the Midwest, a nameless man wandering as a vagrant in the Northwest. Each whisper rekindled her hope, no matter how faint. She dragged Captain Jones, her old tormentor, back to court again and again, forcing him to answer for his betrayal and unpaid judgment, as though punishing him might somehow keep Walter's memory alive in the eyes of the law. But beneath her battles with the city, she lived a quieter, lonelier crusade. Every day, in small ways, in secret prayers, she searched. Christine Collins never remarried, she never moved away. Her heart remained shackled to the last day she saw her child, to the fragile hope that he might still walk back through the door, dime in hand, fresh from the movies. On December 8th, 1964, the vigil ended. Christine died at the age of 75, but she died still waiting, still searching, still believing. The world went on, but Walter Collins remained in limbo, neither alive nor dead, neither saved nor fully lost. His absence became his presence, an echo too loud to fade. Was he butchered on that desolate chicken ranch, his bones erased by fire and lime? Was he spirited away in the back seat of some stranger's car, doomed to another fate unknown? Or did he truly survive, slipping free of both police and murderers, only to wander the world nameless, his identity forever stolen? We cannot answer. Gordon took the secrets to the grave. Sarah Louise contradicted herself into irrelevance, and Christine carried her unanswered prayer into eternity. That is the cruelest aspect of this tale, the way it never closes. Walter Collins remains not simply a missing boy, but a haunting, a silence that still hums in the bones of Los Angeles. A boy forever 9 years old, forever stepping into the sunlight with a dime in his pocket, and forever vanishing into mystery. April 6th, 1922. The hamlet of Goas al Ludu was little more than a solitary dwelling, tucked away in the rugged countryside near Saint-Rivoal, in the Finistère department of Brittany, surrounded by the windswept slopes of the Mont d'Arrée. It belonged to the canton of Pleyben and the district of Châteaulin, a remote and quiet corner of France where life followed the slow rhythm of the land. It was here that a 2-year-old Pauline Picard had been playing near her family's farmhouse, no different than any other afternoon, and then she was gone. No footsteps, no cry, no trace on the damp soil. One moment her mother saw her toddling near the yard. The next, there was only the heavy silence of the fields. Neighbours searched the village, calling her name into the woods, the streams, the pastures. Nothing. By nightfall, it was as if Pauline had been lifted straight out of the world. That very day, more than 150 villagers poured onto the Picard farm and into the countryside beyond. They scoured the fields, the hedgerows, and the thick woods, searching every hollow and streambed for some trace of the missing toddler. But as dusk fell, not a single clue was uncovered. With hope fading, the family tried to accept grim explanations. Perhaps Pauline had wandered too far and perished in the cold, or else been mauled by one of the wild boars that roamed the region. Yet the absence of a body troubled everyone. If the land had claimed her, why had it left no sign behind? Rumours began to coil through the village. Some whispered of a chimney sweep who had passed through, offering candy to children. A neighbour claimed she had seen two strange men lingering near the farm on the day of the disappearance. Others pointed to the age-old suspicion of gypsies, though none had been seen in the vicinity. By night's end, the theories multiplied, but certainty remained out of reach. Pauline had vanished, and the silence of the fields offered no answers. On May 6, 1922, the Picard family received astonishing news. A child resembling Pauline had been spotted in Cherbourg, nearly 250 miles from the remote Breton farm where she had vanished. She had been wandering the streets alone, a small figure lost amid the city's bustle. The accounts of her discovery were tangled and conflicting. Le Matin, a magazine reporting in 1922, said she had been abandoned in the hallway of a local home on Rue Coypel. In 1924, L'Ouest Éclair. Another magazine told a different story, claiming she had been left at a woman's house on Rue Crespel. Decades later, Ozzy described a stranger tale. The girl had been in the company of a raggedly dressed woman who tried to abandon her inside a store, only to be chased down and forced to take her back. Each version offered a new mystery, leaving the truth obscured. The child was taken into a hospice, but she remained silent, refusing to speak a word. When a photograph of her reached Pauline's mother, Marianne, recognition was instant and overwhelming. It was truly her daughter. Without delay, the family boarded a train for Cherbourg, desperate to reclaim the child they had feared lost forever. On May 8th, the Picards arrived in Cherbourg, the weight of a month's uncertainty pressing down on them. They went straight to the hospice, their minds swirling with hope, dread, and the faint, fragile possibility that they might finally see their daughter again. When they entered the room and glimpsed the girl, a flicker of recognition passed through their hearts. They were convinced instinctively that this child was Pauline, but the child offered no response. She sat quietly, her eyes distant, her small body unmoving. Their voices, filled with relief and pleading, seemed to vanish in the sterile room. Even when spoken to in Breton, the familiar tongue of their home and hearts, she gave no sign of understanding. The Picards remained with her, coaxing and caressing, murmuring every word of love they could summon. Yet the girl's gaze was empty, as if a shadow had settled where recognition should have been. She looked nothing like the lively toddler they remembered. Her limbs were thin, her cheeks hollow, her clothes strange and unfamiliar. Though her health appeared sound under medical examination, she seemed to belong to another world, carried away, and returned in a state that made her almost unrecognizable. Every object she possessed, clothes, trinkets, even the smallest possessions, was foreign to her parents. The girl existed there before them, yet apart, like a ghost suspended between the life she had lost and the one she had yet to remember. The silence in the room was heavier than words, pressing down with the weight of a mystery that had crossed hundreds of miles and remained unresolved. For the Picards, the hope of reunion was tempered by a quiet, gnawing fear. Who, or what, had their daughter become in the time she had been gone? After 2 hours in the dimly lit room with the girl, a shadow of doubt began to creep over the Picards. Each glance, each silence, gnawed at their certainty. Could this truly be Pauline? The girl's stillness and lack of recognition unsettled them, and the seeds of unease were echoed by the authorities. The public prosecutor urged the family to remain at the hospice for another day. Le Petit Parisien newspaper went further, reporting that the child was likely not their missing daughter. Yet François Picard, resolute and unwilling to surrender hope, insisted the girl was indeed Pauline. To him, her familiar blue eyes and hair were unmistakable. Despite the swirling uncertainty, the public prosecutor reluctantly released the child into the care of her parents, who departed Cherbourg the following morning. The hospice entrusted the girl to her family with cautious optimism. They believed that the warmth of home, the presence of familiar surroundings, might coax memory and speech from her. Perhaps, they hoped, This was a child merely traumatized, weakened by hunger and fear, who would slowly return to the lively, recognizable daughter they had lost. Yet beneath that hope lingered an unspoken question. What had she endured in the week she had vanished, and would home be enough to bring her fully back? Any lingering doubts that the girl might not be Pauline Picard were quickly dismissed, attributed to amnesia caused by severe post-traumatic stress. Doctors speculated that the child had endured some form of abuse at the hands of her captor, leaving her withdrawn and silent. Returning her to her family, they hoped, would provide the familiarity and safety needed to coax her back to speech and normalcy. Yet one question remained stubbornly unanswered. How had she travelled all the way to Cherbourg, hundreds of miles from the remote Breton farm? When the Picards arrived back at Goas-al-Ludu on May 12th, the girl remained mute, her eyes wide with fear. Even the familiar fields of her home could not calm her. She shrieked and clung to her parents when taken to the area where she had been abducted. Yet the hospice nurses from Cherbourg, who had accompanied the family, observed something more subtle. Beneath the fear, the girl seemed to respond to her surroundings, as though a small part of her remembered the safety of home. In that fragile interaction, hope lingered that the familiar world of her family might slowly help her reclaim the child she had once been. On May 13th, a local farmer, 49-year-old Yves Martin, arrived at the Picard home, his presence casting an uneasy shadow over the household. Approaching the family, he questioned the child with an air of disbelief. "Is the little girl back?" "It's really her?" he asked, his voice trembling, leaving the Picards unsettled by the strange intensity in his eyes. Then, without warning, Martin muttered words that sent a chill through those present. Reports varied. Some claimed he said, "God forgive me, I am guilty." Others, "God help me, I'm guilty." A confession delivered in a trembling, urgent tone. Moments later, he bolted from the house, laughing wildly, his cries echoing across the quiet fields. Authorities soon admitted him to a psychiatric hospital in Quimper on May 14th, leaving the village with more questions than answers, and a renewed sense of unease around the mystery of Pauline's disappearance. In the closing days of May 1922, a dark shadow fell once more over the Picard farm. Not far from the familiar fields, a body was discovered. Decomposed, mutilated, a grim echo of the girl who had vanished weeks before. The reports were muddled, conflicting like whispers carried on the wind. Some said a cyclist stumbled upon the remains on May 25th, mere hundreds of meters from the village. Others claimed it was a day later, or that a farmer had found the corpse about a mile from Goas-al-Ludu. When the gendarmes arrived to inspect the scene, a silent procession of villagers followed, drawn by a mixture of fear, sorrow, and morbid curiosity. Among them were the Picards, hearts heavy with dread. The body had been found in a ditch that had already been searched thoroughly after Pauline's disappearance. Proof, if any were needed, that the girl's fate had been far from ordinary. Officials from Brasparts and Rennes confirmed the identity, leaving the village with a lingering chill and the haunting sense that something terrible had unfolded unseen. The scene that greeted the Picards and the authorities was one of macabre precision. The child's body had been stripped bare, her head severed, and both hands and feet removed. Not far from her lay the skull of an adult man, partially eaten by scavenging foxes, hinting at a second, equally tragic victim. Amid the grim tableau, items of clothing were strangely orderly. A pair of boots, socks, and a heavy dress, soaked with blood, were placed together as if arranged deliberately. The family immediately recognized them as the garments their daughter had worn the day she vanished. Curiously, despite the ravages of time and nature, her torso and abdomen remained untouched, a detail that unsettled the observers. By May 27, 1922, the press and François Picard himself were convinced the remains were indeed Pauline's. Yet when a commissioner from Rennes asked for confirmation, doubt flickered in François' expression. "These are her clothes," he murmured. "But Is it really her? Another child could resemble her so closely. The unease lingered. A haunting uncertainty layered atop an already horrifying discovery. The end of May brought an air of tension over the quiet countryside. Word spread that a judge from Châteaulin would soon take over the investigation, a move prompted by the growing embarrassment of local officials who had mishandled the case so far. Dr. Poulican was the first to scrutinize the remains and quickly noticed injuries that demanded closer inspection. The body was sent to Châteaulin, where Dr. Goriot later conducted a detailed examination. Among his findings was a precise stab wound in the groin, small in size but deep enough to be fatal. Other markings on the bones hinted at either scavenger activity or deliberate cutting. The emptiness of the girl's stomach suggested she had gone without nourishment, whether starved while alone or intentionally deprived by those who held her remained a troubling question. Each grim discovery added to the unsettling mystery surrounding her final days. Despite the violent appearance of the injuries, early investigations wavered between two grim possibilities. Had the child been murdered, or had she succumbed to the merciless elements? Even a detailed autopsy could offer no clarity, leaving authorities frustrated and the family in torment. When the judge from Châteaulin finally pronounced the remains as those of Pauline Picard, he concluded that her death was accidental. The small girl was interred in Saint-Rivoal, her fragile frame laid to rest in a simple white wooden coffin, the village gathering silently to mourn. Yet the circumstances surrounding her body's discovery continued to haunt the community. The location where she had been found had been meticulously searched in the days following her disappearance, so thoroughly that, as a local priest remarked, if someone had dropped a wallet, it would have been uncovered. How she had come to lie there, untouched and hidden from all who combed the area, remained a chilling enigma. Whispers of foul play persisted. Skeptics noted the unnatural pattern of her injuries. Scavengers rarely consume a head and limbs while leaving the torso untouched, suggesting the hand of a human rather than the wild. Suspicion festered quietly among townsfolk and even some law enforcement, the mystery deepening with every retelling. By June, strange rumours began circulating through Brittany like a cold wind. Some claimed Pauline had not died at all, that she had been taken by a wealthy family who, for reasons unknown, left the corpse of another child in her place. Newspapers like Le Petit Parisien speculated that these revelations could force the authorities to reopen the investigation, plunging the village and its people back into the dark uncertainty that had never truly lifted. Shadows of doubt, deception, and unspoken horrors seemed to settle permanently over Saint-Rivoal, leaving the question of Pauline's fate to linger like a ghost over the rugged Breton countryside. With the grim discovery of Pauline's body, a new and confounding question gripped Brittany. Who was the little girl from Cherbourg whom the Picards had so tenderly cared for, believing her to be their lost daughter? The air was thick with uncertainty, as the girl's true identity seemed to slip further from comprehension. By the end of May 1922, the woman who had been seen attempting to abandon a child in the streets of Cherbourg was finally located, yet the mystery only deepened. She had not been accompanied by Pauline, but by her own daughter. Rumours swirled that the child's parents had perhaps crossed the Atlantic, emigrating to America, leaving the young girl adrift and alone. Prosecutors, eager to clarify the confusion, arranged for her return to a hospice on June 13th. Time, however, began to reveal small miracles. Over the next 2 months, the girl began to speak in complete sentences, carefully using the Breton language, her words stirring whispers in the press. Newspapers proclaimed her a Breton child and cautiously suggested, once more, that she might indeed be the real Pauline Picard. Her smile, delicate and enigmatic, captivated readers, who quickly dubbed her the girl with the pretty smile. Interest in her grew, drawing families who petitioned to adopt her, each hoping to claim a fragment of the mystery that seemed to cling to her very being. The civil court of Cherbourg eventually christened her Marie-Louise Pauline, placing her in the protective care of the Franciscan Sisters of Notre-Dame du Vieux. Yet even as she seemed to find a semblance of safety and belonging, fate remained cruelly unpredictable. On January 2nd, 1924, the fragile child succumbed to a sudden outbreak of measles, leaving the lingering question of her identity forever suspended in the shadows of Brittany's misty countryside. The very field where Pauline's lifeless form was eventually found had already been scrutinized with painstaking care in the days following her disappearance. The fact that no trace of her had been discovered during the initial searches cast a chilling shadow over the case. Investigators began to entertain a dark possibility. Perhaps she had been deliberately placed there after her death, her body hidden until the right moment. Even more unsettling were the clothes found alongside her, folded with meticulous precision, as if someone had intended to send a message or mask the horror of the scene. The careful arrangement suggested calculated intent rather than a chance encounter with nature's cruelty. Each detail whispered of a hand behind the tragedy, a prey, sense both deliberate and elusive, and yet the mystery deepened further. Nearby lay the skull of a grown man, its features ravaged by time and scavengers, a silent testament to another nameless victim. Who had this second life belonged to? Why had their remains ended up so close to the girls? The unanswered questions hung in the air like a dense fog, leaving the village and the authorities alike shivering in the uneasy grip of dread. From the earliest days of the investigation, a shadow of suspicion fell upon Christophe Keramon, a man whose reputation preceded him. An umbrella salesman by trade, he had once worked as a farmhand for the Picard family and was invited to share breakfast on the morning Pauline vanished. Rumours of his past loomed over him. He had served a 5-year prison sentence for rape, a history that made even casual observers wary. Those who knew him spoke of an unsettling fondness he showed toward the little girl, often cradling her in ways that drew whispers among neighbours. On at least 2 occasions, he was overheard telling Pauline that he would find her a good home in a distant town, a phrase that would later chill investigators to the bone. Around midday, when the household was briefly distracted, Keramon found himself alone with the child. Witnesses claimed he spoke to her in a tone that suggested he intended to take her somewhere, though the exact meaning remained frustratingly ambiguous. Authorities quickly apprehended him, not initially for the disappearance, but for failing to carry his identification papers, the carnet anthropométrique. Questioned thoroughly, he spent a month in custody on separate charges of fraud, a period shadowed by public curiosity and fear. Yet when testimony from Pauline Picard placed Keramon miles away from the farm at the critical hour, the weight of suspicion shifted, and he was released on May 10th. Still, the memory of his strange attentions and the eerie tone of his words lingered in the minds of all who remembered that fateful morning, leaving an uneasy whisper of doubt in the air. Yet Yves Martin's unsettling confession was only one shadow among many in the strange and tragic tale of Pauline Picard. On the morning she vanished, a local woman has seen 2 unfamiliar figures, strangers with foreign features, lurking near the farm. Their eyes seemed fixed on the child with an intensity that made the witness shiver, as if they were waiting, watching, and calculating some unspoken plan. Days of searching and questioning turned up nothing. The strangers had melted into the mists of the Breton Hills, leaving behind only whispers, suspicion, and a deepening sense of dread. The case seemed to fold in on itself, each clue opening new questions instead of answers. Who had left Pauline's body in the carefully searched field? Why was her corpse mutilated in such a disturbing manner? And whose skull had been discovered alongside her? And that mysterious girl from Cherbourg, was she ever truly Pauline, or another tragic soul caught in the same web? To this day, the truth remains elusive. The fields of Goas Aludu still hold their secrets, and the villagers speak in hushed tones of a child whose fate was never fully understood. Listeners are left with a haunting thought. what truly happened to little Pauline Picard. Was she a victim of a random cruel accident, a calculated act of malice, or something even more sinister? An answer that may never be uncovered. In the late autumn of 1946, a young student named Paula Jean Welden left her dormitory at Bennington College for what she described as nothing more than a walk. She carried little more than a knapsack and a restless spirit. That simple departure was the last verifiable moment of her existence. She did not return, and the trail she intended to follow became a riddle that has never been solved. Her vanishing soon drew attention to a shadowy region in southern Vermont, a place locals speak of with caution. The area later branded the Bennington Triangle. At its heart rises Glastonbury Mountain, a brooding peak covered in thick wilderness and steeped in superstition. The land around it tells its own story of abandonment. Small settlements that once thrived on lumber and industry had long since withered, leaving only crumbling foundations and forgotten roads, silent as tombstones. For centuries, the mountain had carried an ominous reputation. Indigenous peoples are said to have steered clear of its slopes, claiming the place was touched by forces best left undisturbed. Later generations added their own whispers, of strange figures half glimpsed among the trees, of unnatural lights darting across the skies, of voices calling out from nowhere in the dead of night. In this stretch of Vermont, people did not merely stray from the path, they vanished outright. Paula Welden's disappearance was not the first, nor would it be the last. It seemed the mountain itself consumed those who wandered too close, leaving behind only speculation, unease, and the chilling question of what it is that waits in the shadows of Glastonbury. On the cold, overcast morning of Sunday, December the 1st, 1946, 18-year-old Paula Jean Welden completed her morning and afternoon shifts at the Commons, the bustling dining hall of Bennington College in Vermont. After labouring through 2 long shifts serving students, she returned to her room in Dewey Hall, the quiet corridors of the dormitory echoing with the faint hum of midday activity. There, she changed into hiking clothes and informed her roommate of her plans for a long trek along the winding trails nearby. Her roommate recalled Paula mentioning, almost in passing, a lingering melancholy she had been experiencing over the past days, an unexplained gloom that had kept her from returning home over Thanksgiving. Paula Jean Welden, the eldest of 4 daughters of William Archibald Welden, a design engineer at Revere Copper and Brass in Stamford, Connecticut, carried herself with quiet poise and independence. Her younger sisters, Pamela, 16, Steph, 14, and little Heather, just 5, admired her, each in their own way. Paula stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a slender frame of 123 pounds. Distinctive marks traced her experiences: a greyish scar on her left knee, a vaccination mark on her right thigh, and a small scar beneath her left eyebrow. She was drawn to the outdoors, moving through life with energy and curiosity. Swimming, biking, skating, hiking, and camping filled her days with motion, while her evenings often carried the gentle strumming of a guitar or the quiet study of botany, observing the subtle patterns of leaves and plants. Paula's world was rich with exploration, both physical and intellectual, and she approached it with a sense of purpose and independence that marked her presence among family and friends alike. On that crisp December afternoon in 1946, Paula Jean Welden departed Bennington College around 2:30 p.m., wrapped in her red parka with a fur-trimmed hood, blue jeans, and sturdy white topsider sneakers. On her wrist gleamed a small gold Elgin watch, its narrow black band and repairer's mark quietly marking time that would soon slip away into uncertainty. Clutched in her hands were a sketchbook, a purse, and a copy of Dante's Inferno, companions for what she intended as a long, reflective hike along the winding long trail. The weather was mild, a surprisingly warm 50 degrees, justifying her light clothing. But as the afternoon waned, the air stiffened with an unrelenting wind, and snow began to dust the treetops. By the following morning, the thermometer would dip to 9 degrees, and the memory of warmth faded like a distant promise. Several witnesses would later recall fleeting glimpses of Paula that day, snapshots in a vanishing frame. Danny Fager, stationed at the service station across from the college entrance, saw her descend the drive at 2:30 p.m., briefly ascend a knoll, then vanish down Route 67A toward Bennington. Minutes later, Louis Knapp encountered her and offered a ride along Route 9, about 3 miles from the Long Trail's entrance. She accepted, disappearing over the hills, soon to continue on foot. By 4 p.m., a group of campers, led by Ernest Whitman, spotted her near Bickford Hollow. Paula paused, asking for directions along the trail, a final exchange with the outside world, before she continued alone toward a bridge marking the trail's beginning. Subsequent sightings, reported by Woodford residents near Fay Fuller Camp, were inconsistent and could not be verified. As darkness settled between 4:15 and 4:30 p.m., Paula Jean Welden entered the forested expanse, poorly clothed for the dropping temperatures and without any provisions. That would be the last anyone ever saw of her. The trail swallowed her in silence, leaving only a cold wind, the whispering trees, and the echo of unanswered questions hanging over the long trail. By the morning of Monday, December 2nd, unease had settled over Bennington College. Paula Jean Welden had failed to appear for her classes, her absence now impossible to ignore. Mary Garrett, the college's director of admissions, felt a chill of dread as she reached for the phone, summoning State's Attorney William Travers Jerome, Jr., to the campus at noon. That same day, Paula's father, William Welden, arrived, worry etched deep into his face, carrying the silent fear of a parent who could sense, without proof, that something had gone terribly wrong. Earlier that afternoon, hopes of a simple explanation led a small party into the wilderness. Paula had once expressed a desire to explore the Everett Cave on Mount Anthony. Henry Steele of Fairdale Farms, acting as a local guide, took a group of students to the cave in search of any sign of her. The rocks were cold and unyielding, the shadows deepening in the fading light. But the cave revealed nothing. Clues, if they existed, were even more elusive in the mundane paths of daily life. Abe Ruskin, a local taxi driver, recalled driving a student to the bus station the previous afternoon, but his memory wavered. Could it have been Paula, or simply another young woman in the flurry of travellers? At the station, clerks were of no help. The building had been bustling with activity that Sunday, buses bound for Pittsfield, New York City, Albany and Burlington. Yet no one could affirm seeing a girl matching her description. Each lead dissolved into uncertainty, leaving only the gnawing question, which direction had Paula taken, and where had she disappeared to? By nightfall, the campus was hushed, the familiar halls of Dewey Hall echoing with a tension that words could not capture. Somewhere beyond the rooftops and the snow-laden hills, Paula's trail had vanished, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness, leaving the college and the town to grapple with the impossible mystery of her disappearance. Late that evening, at the modern restaurant on Pleasant Street, a waitress named Aura Telletier noticed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Paula Welden. It was around 9:30 p.m. The girl was not alone. She was accompanied by a man in his mid-20s, whose behaviour was unruly and aggressive, his words slurred with alcohol. At one point, he went to the counter, leaving the girl momentarily free. She motioned for Aura to come closer and spoke in a quiet, urgent tone. "How far is it to Bennington, Vermont?" she asked, her eyes wary. "Where am I?" She explained she had arrived in Fall River with $1,000, but now had nothing left. Despite her calm demeanour, there was a distant, dazed quality to her gaze, a hint that something was profoundly wrong. She had not been drinking herself, yet there was a heaviness in her movements, a sense of disorientation that unsettled even the experienced waitress. News of the sighting quickly spread. Local media reported the encounter, and photographs of Paula were circulated across New York and Massachusetts. Yet, despite the attention, no one could locate her. The trail seemed to vanish as suddenly as the girl herself. On Tuesday, December 3rd, the search for Paula Welden intensified, though the young woman had already been missing for 2 days. R.N. Thompson, manager of Vermont Transit in Burlington, took immediate action, promising to contact every bus driver who had departed from Bennington on Sunday afternoon. The hope was to determine whether Paula had boarded one of the vehicles, though by now the trail was already growing cold. Meanwhile, organised searches focused on the college campus and the stretch of the long trail leading toward the Glastonbury fire station, where the path crossed Route 9 near the desolate hollows of Hell Hollow and Bickford Hollow. These areas, already steeped in local lore and whispered warnings of the forest's strange, isolating nature, now became ground zero for the desperate hunt. Leadership fell to Frank Chorn, superintendent of buildings and grounds at Bennington College, who coordinated squads of volunteers tirelessly combining the woods on Tuesday and Wednesday. Among those lending their aid was Herman Spencer, a seasoned hunter who often stayed at Sawsville Camp, halfway to the Glastonbury Tower. Students from Bennington College, Boy Scouts, 25 from Williams College, members of the Green Mountain Club, and 30 other local volunteers fanned out across the trails, their footsteps crunching the frost-laden earth, eyes scanning the shadowed tree lines for any sign of the missing girl. Even Sheriff W. Clyde Peck, a man intimately familiar with the twists and turns of the long trail, joined the search on Wednesday night, casting his flashlight across the inky darkness, the cold wind carrying a sense of foreboding. Late Tuesday afternoon, Ernie Whitman, the night watchman at the Banner newspaper, caught sight of Paula Welden's photograph on the front page. The image instantly reminded him of the brief encounter from Sunday in Woodford around 4 p.m. while returning from a camp with his friends, Stearns, Mary Rice, and Lyman Royce. A young woman had approached them seeking guidance to the long trail. She inquired about the trail's length, mentioning her plan to walk along it. They explained that while the path extended all the way to Canada, they themselves had only travelled a short portion. After offering a quiet thanks, she crossed a small bridge and vanished into the dense forest. Upon seeing the photo, Paula's father, Frank Howe II, along with reporter Pete Stevenson, immediately set out to Woodford to retrace her steps. Locals confirmed having seen her heading toward the long trail, last observed near a camp called Hunter's Rest. The group moved carefully along the path, scrutinizing the area on both sides of the trail in the dwindling light. The snow, still fresh from Sunday night, blanketed the ground in a layer of icy obstruction, slowing their progress. They continued toward a camp owned by William Lawson, situated several miles below the Glastonbury fire tower. Considering the icy streams and Paula's lack of proper footwear, it seemed unlikely she could have made it that far. When the group finally reached William Lawson's camp, he reported having seen no trace of Paula. However, he mentioned that earlier on Sunday, 3 servicemen, J.W. Carroll, William Watts, and M. Golder, had passed through the area, ill-prepared for the trail. They had left a suitcase behind with him and never returned. Curious, the group examined its contents, but it yielded no clues. Lawson also recalled a grim tale from the previous year. A deer hunter named Middy Rivers had vanished from his camp, never to be found. In a bid for insight, the group consulted Clara Jepson, a local clairvoyant, who directed them toward the covered bridge. Yet when they investigated, nothing awaited them there. Authorities, reviewing the scattered reports, began to suspect that 2 young women had been present near the long trail that Sunday. Both bore a striking resemblance to Paula, though one was taller and accompanied by a man with a car. As night fell over the campus, the college administration revealed that officials suspected a sinister hand in Paula's disappearance. They believed her absence was deliberate and that she may have been deliberately hidden from view. Investigators had already questioned 3 men who had spent the weekend in the remote Glastonbury region, but the interviews yielded little insight. Meanwhile, a merchant in town recounted a peculiar visit from a young man, accompanied by 2 companions. The group had purchased garments, casually mentioning an excursion into the hills. The man claimed to be enrolled in a photographic school in New Haven. By the next morning, Law enforcement in Fall River had taken note of his description, linking him to ongoing inquiries and amplifying the cloud of suspicion surrounding the mysterious events. As the first pale light of December 5th crept across the mountains, teams fanned out over a vast stretch of wilderness spanning the ridge between Bold and Glastonbury peaks. More than 100 volunteers, drawn from nearby colleges and the local population, joined forces under the direction of Sheriff Clyde Peck. Reinforcements came in the form of 5 small planes surveying the treetops and nearly 120 members of the State Guard, bringing the total search party close to 500 determined souls. Each participant carried markers to signal which areas had been scoured, a method intended to prevent repetition and to ensure no fragment of terrain went unexamined. Attention turned to a narrow trail winding over Ball Mountain after a faculty member reported unusual impressions in the soil, possibly left by a sneakered foot. Yet despite the meticulous sweep, the wilderness yielded no trace of the missing young woman. By late afternoon, officials concluded the long trail had been thoroughly combed and declared it unlikely she remained there. Her father, weary but composed, expressed his confidence in the exhaustive effort. That evening, an experienced woodsman stationed on Glastonbury's eastern slopes near Searsburg claimed to have caught a woman's anguished cry echoing through the trees. Authorities hurried to investigate, combing the area with lanterns and dogs, but the forest kept its secrets, revealing nothing. The mountains seemed to swallow all traces, leaving only silence in the wake of the desperate call. A substantial sum, $500, was pledged to anyone who could provide a lead that might reveal the missing girl's whereabouts. Within her dormitory, several classmates remarked on the unusual brightness of her mood the previous evening, suggesting that she might have been contemplating a sudden change or a new direction in her life. Some speculated that her solitary trek could have been more than a simple hike, perhaps a deliberate escape from the ordinary, a private journey into the unknown. By mid-December, official search efforts were officially called off, leaving the mystery unresolved. Months later, as the snow retreated with the arrival of spring, her father mounted a personal expedition over 2 days, combing the frozen and thawing woods with hope, yet discovering nothing. Frustration with the investigative approach gnawed at him. He lamented the absence of precise techniques and modern organization in the search. Ironically, his criticisms would sow the seeds for a more structured law enforcement presence in the state, ultimately leading to the establishment of a dedicated Vermont police force just 7 months later. It is conceivable that Paula wandered off the marked path, yet the trail itself is hemmed in by a narrow brook and steep slopes, leaving little room for movement. The terrain beyond is treacherous. Jagged rocks, tangled roots, and rushing water create a natural barrier that would deter even the most experienced hiker. This is why the first responders and volunteers restricted their sweep to a slender corridor, barely 20 feet on either side of the trail, believing that venturing further could be too dangerous and likely fruitless. Perhaps Paula discovered a secluded nook away from the trail where she intended to rest for the night, mirroring an earlier excursion she had taken with her friend Elizabeth just weeks before. Maybe she had planned to resume her journey at dawn, unaware of the sudden deterioration of the weather. Snow, wind, and the drop in temperature may have transformed the familiar woods into a perilous labyrinth, isolating her in a way no one could have anticipated. Yet another possibility gnaws at the imagination. Did someone encounter her while she returned to the dormitory? Was there a hidden threat lurking along the shadowed stretches of the trail, or beyond, waiting to ensnare the unwary? The notion of malicious interference, intentional harm, cannot be ruled out, though no evidence has ever confirmed it. Decades have slipped by, yet Paula's absence lingers like a wound that refuses to heal. Her whereabouts remain a haunting void, an unfinished sentence in the story of her family and community. When she vanished, her personal effects disappeared with her. No trinket, no garment, no trace of her daily life was left behind. It was as though she had been carefully erased, removed from the world in a single merciless gesture. Search parties combed the forests and rivers, investigators sifted through countless dead ends. Every promising lead dissolved into smoke, every whispered account of a fleeting figure glimpsed at the edge of the woods collapsed under scrutiny. Rumours grew into folklore until Paula became less a person and more a ghostly presence, the subject of hushed conversations in diners, midnight speculations on front porches, and the occasional shiver-inducing tale told to children. Yet despite the silence, the case has never truly died. It sits, cold but stubbornly alive, smouldering in the memories of those who once knew her and those who can't resist the pull of the mystery. The Vermont hills, cloaked in fog and shadow, seem to guard the secret as jealously as if they were complicit. Time has not softened the enigma. If anything, the passing years have only deepened its shadow, turning Paula's disappearance into a story that resists conclusion. The chapter remains open, a ledger of unanswered questions and mute testimonies, haunting the landscape like an echo that refuses to fade. Beneath the towering cliffs of the Grand Canyon, where shadows stretch long across the ancient rock and the Colorado River whispers like an eternal tongue, there lingers a tale that refuses to die. The canyon, with its walls carved by time into jagged cathedrals of stone, has devoured countless lives, adventurers, wanderers, and dreamers swallowed by its silence and its merciless waters. Its vastness humbles the living and entombs the dead, leaving only echoes carried on the wind. Yet among all these shadows, few names resonate in its depths as eerily, as hauntingly as those of Glenn and Bessie Hyde, whose story clings to the gorge like mist that will not lift. In the winter of 1928, they set out with ambition, daring to tame a river that was more monster than water. Days later, their vessel was found adrift, eerily intact, food supplies untouched, belongings undisturbed. Yet the couple themselves had dissolved into the canyon's silence, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. To this day, rafters and wanderers who pass along those winding waters feel the weight of their absence. Some swear the air grows colder near the stretch where they disappeared. Others whisper of strange voices carried on the night wind. Were they dragged under by the rapids? Did betrayal or hidden darkness turn them against one another? Or was it something older, something the canyon keeps for itself, beyond the reach of reason? The Grand Canyon does not give answers. It only holds secrets, and in its depths the question still murmurs like the current. What became of Glenn and Bessie Hyde? In the final months of 1928, a young couple, Glenn and Bessie Hyde, set out upon the Colorado River with ambitions as bold as the waters themselves. They had only recently married, and together they sought to conquer the river's notorious whitewater passages, a task so perilous that few men attempted it, and no woman had yet endured it. If their journey reached its intended conclusion, Bessie would claim a place in history as the first woman known to master that unforgiving route. But history did not grant them triumph. The Hydes drifted into the canyon's labyrinth of towering walls and roaring currents, last observed alive in the chill of November. After that, they slipped entirely from human knowledge. No cries for help, no message scrawled in desperation, no bodies washed ashore, only silence, heavy and enduring, as if the canyon itself had swallowed them whole. What became of Glenn and Bessie Hyde remains one of the river's most enduring riddles. Did the water take them, dashing their fragile craft against stone, or did some darker fate befall them in the depths of the canyon, hidden from sight but not from imagination? Their story began not in the canyons of the Colorado, but on the deck of a passenger liner bound for California in 1927. Among strangers, two souls crossed paths: Glenn Hyde, a seasoned outdoorsman with a restless spirit, and Bessie, whose life had only recently taken a dramatic turn. Less than a year later, on an April afternoon in 1928, they married, a date chosen with a strange symmetry. It marks 16 years to the day since the Titanic had vanished beneath the Atlantic, and it came scarcely a day after Bessie had severed her previous marriage. Fate, it seemed, already wove irony into their union. Glenn was no ordinary dreamer. He crafted vessels with his own hands and had already tested his courage on the wild torrents of Idaho's Salmon and Snake rivers. Bessie, however, was still a stranger to such unforgiving waters. To him, she was not only a partner in life, but a companion for the grandest of journeys. And so he shaped a vessel from timber, a 20-foot scow designed to endure the fury of the rapids. In October of that same year, they pushed away from the familiar and into the unknown, their honeymoon not of flowers and dances, but of roaring currents and canyon shadows. For Glenn, the journey was not a leisurely drift upon the water, nor simply a romantic escapade cloaked in canyon winds. He carried within him a fierce determination, a hunger to etch his name into the annals of exploration. The river, brutal and unrelenting, was the proving ground. He longed to conquer it swiftly, to claim a record that few had dared even to chase. Yet his ambition stretched beyond his own pride. At his side was Bessie, untested by the river's merciless moods, but poised to become something more than a passenger. If their gamble succeeded, she would step into the chronicles of history as the first woman known to endure and triumph over the Grand Canyon's raging heart. It was a dream wrapped in both glory and danger, a gamble with the river itself as their silent adversary. From the careful notes left in Bessie's diary, it appeared the pair were not only on track, but moving faster than expected. Their voyage paused on November 16th, when they climbed up the Bright Angel Trail in search of supplies. Along the path, fate introduced them to two well-known canyon figures, Ellsworth and Emery Kolb, the famed brothers whose studio clung precariously to the cliffs, a place where thousands of travellers had immortalized their journeys on film. The Hydes, eager but weary, knocked upon the Kolb's door and shared their story. Newlyweds on an audacious honeymoon, 26 days into a struggle against the untamed river. The brothers, charmed by the tale, agreed to photograph the couple on the canyon's edge, promising the image would be ready once the river odyssey was finished. Emery would later recall small, unsettling details. Glenn, confident to the point of recklessness, casually revealed they carried no safety vests. The admission stirred a warning from Emery, but Glenn only brushed it off with an easy laugh. Beside him, Bessie betrayed unease. Her face, Emery said, carried a shadow of worry about the miles still ahead. As the Hydes prepared to descend the trail back to their craft, Emery's daughter Emily appeared, elegantly dressed. Bessie glanced at her polished shoes and murmured wistfully, almost as if to herself, "I wonder if I shall ever wear such fine things again." Accounts gathered years later suggest that a curious figure may have joined the Hydes as they descended once more into the vast gorge, a man identified as Adolphe Cisutro. Some reports claim he carried his camera, snapping images of the newlyweds before accompanying them partway downriver. For a short stretch, he is said to have shared their vessel, drifting alongside them upon the restless current. If the recollections are true, Sutro may have borne silent witness to their final moments upon the river's surface. After he departed, the couple's journey slipped into legend, leaving Sutro not only a bystander, but perhaps the last living soul to ever gaze upon them as they vanished into the labyrinth of water and stone. As winter pressed into December, silence hung heavy over the canyon. No letters, no sightings, no word at all from the Hydes. Unease grew until Emery Kolb, unable to dismiss the weight of foreboding, organized a search. A small aircraft was dispatched to sweep the yawning chasm, skimming low through the granite corridors where shadows clung like secrets. From above, the pilot caught sight of something jarring against the current. The Hyde's wooden craft, wedged against jagged stone, seemingly abandoned yet eerily intact. When a rescue team, Kolb among them, fought their way down to the stranded vessel, what they uncovered deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Supplies were still orderly, untouched. Their clothing remained folded, provisions still ample, books undisturbed, and Bessie's handwritten notes carefully tucked away. Even the camera had been recovered, its final frame haunting in its stillness, an image fixed near the 165th mile of river, captured late in November. Beyond that last photograph, there were no footprints, no discarded gear, no sign of struggle. Just the boat, waiting like an abandoned stage, set after its players had vanished into the unseen. Wreath Hyde, unwilling to let the river keep its silence, gathered a company of men and sent them into the twisting heart of the canyon. Their task was grim yet desperate, to uncover even the faintest trace of Glenn and Bessie. The men scoured the cliffs, searched the riverbanks, and studied the waters where the couple had last been known to drift. But the wilderness gave no reply. Day after day slipped into weeks, and the weeks stretched into long, hollow months. Still, the canyons stood mute, their shadows hiding whatever truth lingered within. The longer the search dragged on without discovery, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. The young couple's story, newlyweds bound by love and swallowed by the unforgiving river, refused to vanish with them. Instead, it lingered, spreading from one campfire tale to another, whispered in towns along the river's edge, and etched into the folklore of the canyon itself. It became more than a disappearance. It became a riddle bound to the cliffs, a haunting silence that time itself could not erode. In the aftermath of the discovery, Glenn's father refused to let the canyon keep its secrets. He assembled a crew of determined men and dispatched them into the maze of stone and river where his son and daughter-in-law had last been seen. They combed the cliffs, traced the river's winding edges, and searched every inlet the current revealed. Yet the gorge remained stubbornly silent. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into empty months, and still no trace of the young couple emerged. Their vanishing, wrapped in the romance of youth and the danger of the river, captured imaginations far beyond the canyon walls. The story refused to fade. Instead, it deepened, gaining weight with every retelling. In the silence left behind, speculation grew wild. Countless theories rose to the surface over the years, each one offering a different fate for Glenn and Bessie, yet none managing to strip away the canyon's enduring silence. Among the countless stories that spiraled out of the Hyde's disappearance, one of the darker whispers painted Glenn as a cruel husband whose temper only worsened beneath the unforgiving sun and stone of the canyon. According to this tale, the endless rapids and the harsh wilderness frayed Bessie's patience until she could endure no more. In a moment of desperation, she is said to have turned against her new husband, ending his life and slipping away into the world beyond the canyon, reinventing herself in secrecy. Those who had truly known Glenn, however, dismissed such ideas outright. They described him not as a brute, but as a man deeply devoted to his bride, incapable of the cruelty he was accused of. Another version of the tale takes the rumour further, insisting that violence did indeed erupt between the couple, that Bessie herself pulled a trigger to end her husband's life. This speculation wove itself into a far stranger rumour decades later, when whispers claimed that an accomplished riverwoman named Georgie Clark, famed for her own daring voyages through the Grand Canyon, was none other than Bessie, living under a new name. Whispers linking Georgie Clark to the vanished bride grew louder after her passing in 1992. For years, she had lived an enigmatic life, keeping even close companions at arm's length. Many who had rafted with her for decades realized, only after she was gone, that not a single one of them had ever been welcomed beyond the threshold of her home. When her belongings were finally sorted, secrets began to unravel. Tucked among her effects was a document that startled those who thought they had known her best, a birth record that listed her as Bessie de Ross. The revelation cracked the carefully constructed identity she had worn for so long. Clark was not her only borrowed name. She had also been known at times as Georgie White, adopting surnames from marriages that ended in separation. The intrigue deepened when, Among Clark's private possessions, her companion stumbled upon two objects that seemed to whisper of hidden truths: a faded document binding Glenn and Bessie Hyde in marriage, and a small pistol carefully tucked away in the folds of a lingerie drawer. The discoveries cast long shadows, igniting speculation that the woman long known as Georgie Clark might have been the lost bride herself, living under an assumed identity. Yet not all were convinced. Colorado River chronicler Brad Dymock, who delved into the Hyde's tragic tale in his book Sunk Without a Sound, examined the relics and compared photographs with a practiced eye. His verdict was clear: Clark and the vanished Bessie were not the same woman. Author Richard Westwood, who traced the life of Georgie Clark in his own writings, echoed that stance. He noted that beyond tantalizing fragments and coincidences, the evidence was insubstantial, offering little more than a fragile scaffolding on which rumour had built its legend. Among the many conjectures that grew from the Hyde's disappearance, one has often been repeated in hushed tones by scholars and storytellers alike, that the newlyweds were swallowed by the river itself. Some historians argue the pair may have unknowingly entered one of the Colorado's deadliest gauntlets, an uncharted section in 1928, lying near the place now known as Mile 232. The waters there roar with a violence capable of tearing even the strongest craft to splinters, and Glenn's handmade scow was hardly fitted for such punishment. According to this notion, the river offered no mercy. Perhaps a sudden plunge sent Bessie overboard, the icy current pulling her beneath the foam. In a desperate reflex, Glenn may have abandoned the boat to reach her, only to be claimed by the same relentless torrent. Their vessel endured, but the lovers themselves vanished into the churning depths, leaving behind no witness, only silence and speculation. During the 1970s, new whispers of Bessie Hyde's fate drifted into the public eye. In 1971, while travellers gathered around a fire on a guided river expedition, an elderly passenger interrupted the evening tale when the legend of the Hydes was recounted. With calm certainty, she declared that she was Bessie herself. According to her confession, the journey through the canyon had unravelled into torment under Glenn's cruel hand. One night, she said, she snapped, plunging a knife into him, abandoning his body, and climbing out of the gorge to forge a hidden existence far from the shadows of the river. Her startling words spread quickly, drawing the attention of historians and journalists who investigated the strange claim. The woman, strikingly similar in stature and appearance to Bessie, turned out to be a retired psychologist with a taste for elaborate stories. Her identity was eventually clarified. Whether her tale was invention or revelation, the mystery of the Hydes endured, strengthened by yet another haunting voice, added to the canyon's long echo of unanswered questions. In 1976, a grim discovery stirred new speculation along the rim of the Grand Canyon. On land, once owned by Emery Kolb, the very photographer who had been among the final witnesses to the Hyde's journey, human remains were uncovered. The skeleton carried a chilling detail, a bullet lodged in the skull, hinting at violence rather than accident. For a moment, whispers spread that perhaps the canyon had finally surrendered the secret of Glenn Hyde. Yet the excitement soon collapsed under scientific scrutiny. Forensic experts studied the bones and determined that they belonged not to a man of Glenn's years, but to someone barely past youth, no older than 22. Even more damning, the evidence showed the death had occurred no earlier than the 1970s, decades after the Hyde's disappearance. Whatever story the bones carried, it was not theirs. The canyon, once again, had offered only misdirection, leaving the fate of Glenn and Bessie buried deeper in shadow. And so the canyon holds its silence. Nearly a century has passed since Glenn and Bessie Hyde vanished into its carved depths, yet their absence continues to echo louder than any answer ever could. Theories have risen and collapsed like shadows against stone. Murder, escape, accident, reinvention, each adding another veil to the mystery rather than lifting it. Their scow was found, their belongings neatly ordered, their last photograph frozen in time, But of the couple themselves, not a single trace was ever recovered. Perhaps they drowned, swallowed by the fury of mile 232's rapids. Perhaps Bessie, weary of hardship, slipped into another life under a different name. Or perhaps the canyon itself claimed them, bearing their story within its ancient silence, beyond the reach of fact or proof. Whatever truth exists lies somewhere in the labyrinth of rock and river, a secret guarded as jealously as the canyon guards its depths. To this day, as the Colorado River carves its relentless path through stone, travelers still whisper their names, wondering if Glenn and Bessie's fate was tragedy, betrayal, or something stranger still. And in that wondering, the Hydes live on, not as bodies, but as a legend, suspended forever between history and myth.